He was taller than people think.
Oh.
That's for sure. People
How tall
think
was he?
He was 6 foot. 6 foot,
Really?
a little more, a little bit.
They said, "Never reveal this." Bob Joyce spoke those words in a small church in Arkansas, his voice trembling slightly as he stood before a congregation that had come to hear him preach, but stayed to hear him finally address the question that has followed him for decades. At 71 years old, Pastor Bob Joyce has spent most of his adult life denying that he is Elvis Presley, living under a new identity. He has insisted, repeatedly and firmly, that he is just Bob Joyce, a man who loves God and happens to have a voice that sounds uncannily like the king of rock and roll. But in recent months, something has changed. Bob has started talking about things he was told never to discuss. Stories about what really happened to Elvis after August 16, 1977, and why so many people connected to the Presley world wanted those stories buried. He has not admitted to being Elvis. He has not claimed to have faked his death. But he has begun speaking about the possibility that the official story of Elvis's final days was incomplete, sanitized, and carefully controlled by people who had reasons to hide the full truth. So who is Bob Joyce? Why do thousands of people believe he is Elvis Presley in disguise? And what is the secret that Bob was told never to reveal about what really happened to the king? Robert Audie Joyce was born on January 21, 1953, in Benton, Arkansas, a small city about 30 miles southwest of Little Rock. Birth records from Saline County confirm the date and location, listing his parents as working-class residents of the area. His childhood was unremarkable in most ways, at least according to the sparse documentation that exists from that era. He grew up in a religious household where church was not just a Sunday obligation, but a central part of life. His family attended a small Baptist congregation, and it was there that Bob first discovered his love for music. By the time Bob was 8 or 9 years old, he was singing in church choirs, his voice already showing the power and clarity that would later make people stop and listen. He learned to play guitar from family members and church musicians, developing a style that drew from gospel, country, and the rock and roll that was exploding across America in the late 1950s and early 60s. Elvis Presley was one of the biggest influences on young musicians during that time, and Bob was no exception. He listened to Elvis records, studied his phrasing, and learned to sing with the same emotional intensity that made Elvis a star. In the 1970s, while Elvis Presley was performing sold-out shows in Las Vegas, struggling with prescription drug addiction, and watching his health deteriorate year by year, Bob Joyce was living a quiet life in Arkansas. He worked various jobs to support himself, everything from construction to factory work, while pursuing music as a passion rather than a career. He played at local churches, performed at community events, and slowly built a reputation as a talented singer with a voice that reminded people of someone famous. Friends and family members would joke that Bob sounded like Elvis, and Bob would laugh it off. Lots of people sounded like Elvis. The king had influenced an entire generation of singers, and Bob was just one of thousands who had absorbed his style and made it their own. There was nothing unusual about it. Nothing that would suggest Bob was anything other than a talented amateur musician living in small-town Arkansas. In his late 20s, Bob felt a calling to ministry. He attended Bible college, studied theology, and eventually became an ordained Baptist minister. His first pastoral positions were at tiny rural churches where the congregation might number 20 or 30 people on a good Sunday. He preached, led worship, performed marriages and funerals, and lived the kind of modest, service-oriented life that thousands of rural pastors live across America. His salary was minimal, often supplemented by side work or support from his wife, who worked as a teacher. Bob married and started a family, raising children who grew up in parsonages and church fellowship halls. His life revolved around his congregation, his family, and his faith. He was not seeking fame or fortune. He was not trying to build a megachurch or become a televangelist. He was content to serve small communities, to use his musical gifts to lead worship, and to live a life that was about ministry rather than attention. Throughout the 1980s and 90s, Bob Joyce pastored churches in Arkansas and occasionally in neighboring states. He developed a following among people who appreciated his preaching style and his musical abilities, but it was always a local following, people who drove from nearby towns to hear him on Sunday mornings. There was no indication that Bob Joyce was anything other than exactly who he claimed to be: a pastor, a musician, a family man dedicated to serving God. And then the internet happened. Sometime in the early 2000s, videos of Bob Joyce singing gospel songs in church started appearing on YouTube. The videos were simple, often shot on low-quality cameras by congregation members who wanted to share their pastor's beautiful voice with friends and family. But when those videos started circulating beyond Bob's immediate community, people noticed something strange. Bob did not just sound like Elvis. He sounded exactly like Elvis. The tone, the phrasing, the vibrato, the way he held certain notes and added subtle flourishes to the melody. It was all eerily familiar to anyone who had ever listened to Elvis Presley. Comments sections exploded. People started comparing Bob's performances to Elvis recordings, analyzing the vocal similarities frame by frame. And then someone noticed the physical resemblance. Bob had the same jawline, the same eye shape, the same general build as Elvis had in his later years. He wore glasses and had graying hair, which made sense if you assumed Elvis had continued aging after 1977. And his mannerisms while singing, the way he moved his hands, the way he tilted his head, the subtle expressions that crossed his face, all bore an uncanny similarity to Elvis Presley. The conspiracy theory took root quickly. Entire websites and YouTube channels were dedicated to proving that Bob Joyce was Elvis Presley living under a new identity. People analyzed voice patterns using audio software, claiming the vocal signatures matched. They studied photographs, creating side-by-side comparisons that highlighted every similarity. They investigated Bob's background, looking for gaps in his documented history that could explain where Elvis had been hiding for decades. The theory went like this: Elvis Presley, exhausted from fame, drowning in debt, and possibly facing threats from organized crime figures he had connections to, faked his own death on August 16, 1977. With the help of a few trusted confidants, he staged the scene at Graceland, used a body double in the casket, and disappeared into a new life as Bob Joyce, a humble pastor in Arkansas where no one would think to look for the king of rock and roll. Believers pointed to supposed evidence, the fact that Elvis's casket was unusually heavy, suggesting it might have contained something other than a body. The oddities in the official autopsy report, which had inconsistencies that raised questions about whether the body examined was actually Elvis. The speed with which he was buried, less than 2 days after his death, which some claimed was suspiciously fast. And the fact that several people close to Elvis had hinted over the years that the official story did not tell the whole truth. Bob Joyce, for his part, has consistently denied being Elvis Presley. In interviews and public statements, he has said that he is just a pastor who happens to sound like Elvis, that the resemblance is coincidental, and that people are seeing patterns that do not actually exist. He has expressed frustration with the constant questions, the invasion of his privacy, and the way the conspiracy theory has overshadowed his ministry. But denials have not stopped the speculation. In fact, they have fueled it. Believers argue that of course Bob would deny being Elvis. If he admitted the truth, the entire purpose of faking his death would be defeated. The denials, they claim, are part of the cover story, a necessary performance to maintain the illusion. And then Bob started saying things that made people wonder if maybe, just maybe, there was more to the story than he had been willing to admit. In sermons over the past few years, Bob has referenced secrets, burdens he has carried, and truths that people have told him never to reveal. He has spoken about how the world often accepts sanitized versions of history without questioning what might have been left out. And he has hinted, in vague and carefully worded ways, that the official narrative surrounding Elvis Presley's death may not capture the full complexity of what actually happened. In one sermon that circulated widely online, Bob talked about redemption and second chances. He said that God sometimes gives people opportunities to start over, to leave behind the mistakes and pressures of their past, and build a new life focused on faith and service. He spoke about how fame can be a prison, how wealth can be a burden, and how sometimes the only way to find peace is to disappear from the world that knows your name. People who believe Bob is Elvis saw this as confirmation. People who think he is just a pastor saw it as a thoughtful reflection on biblical themes. But either way, the sermon added fuel to the fire. The theory about Elvis faking his death is not new, and it did not originate with Bob Joyce. It has existed in various forms since 1977, with different versions emphasizing different motives and methods. Understanding these theories is essential to understanding why Bob Joyce became such a focal point for believers. Some versions focus on financial problems. Elvis was reportedly millions of dollars in debt at the time of his death, despite earning enormous sums throughout his career. His manager, Colonel Tom Parker, had negotiated deals that heavily favored himself over Elvis, taking 50% of Elvis's earnings and making financial decisions that left the king with less money than anyone realized. Elvis owed significant back taxes to the IRS. He had expensive habits, including his tendency to buy cars, jewelry, and houses on impulse, and give them away to friends, family, and strangers. And he was supporting a large entourage of people who depended on him for their livelihoods. The financial pressure was intense, and some theorists believe that faking his death allowed Elvis to escape those obligations. If he was legally dead, his debts would become the estate's problem. He would no longer be responsible for supporting dozens of people, and he could start over with whatever money he had managed to hide away before his alleged death. Other versions of the theory emphasize threats from organized crime. Elvis had connections to law enforcement that went back to the early 1970s. He had met with President Richard Nixon in 1970 and received an honorary DEA badge, which he took seriously despite his own drug use. Elvis had allegedly helped the FBI with investigations into organized crime figures, providing information about drug trafficking and mob activities that he learned about through his connections in the entertainment industry. Some conspiracy theorists believe that those connections made Elvis a target. They point to the fact that several people connected to Elvis died under suspicious circumstances in the years following his death. They reference threats that Elvis allegedly received, warnings from people who told him to stay out of certain business dealings or face consequences. And they suggest that faking his death was the only way to protect himself and his family from retaliation by people who saw him as a liability or a threat. There are also stories about Elvis's involvement with the Fraternal Order of Police and other law enforcement organizations. Elvis collected badges and honorary titles from police departments across the country. And some believers argue that these connections gave him access to resources that could have helped him fake his death. Police officers who could falsify documents, coroners who could manipulate autopsy reports, government officials who could create a new identity complete with social security number, birth certificate, and background documentation. The idea sounds far-fetched until you consider how much power and influence Elvis actually had in 1977. He was one of the most famous people in the world. He had relationships with politicians, law enforcement officials, and powerful figures in the entertainment industry. And he had loyal associates who would have done almost anything to help him if he asked. Still, other versions focus on exhaustion and burnout, and these might be the most psychologically credible. Elvis was performing constantly in the months before his death, despite being in terrible physical condition. He was overweight, addicted to prescription medications, suffering from glaucoma, high blood pressure, an enlarged colon, and liver damage. His doctor, George Nicopolis, was prescribing him massive quantities of drugs to keep him functioning, to help him sleep, to wake him up, to manage pain, to control his moods. Elvis was trapped in a cycle that was literally killing him. He needed to perform to pay his bills and support his entourage. But performing required drugs to function, and the drugs were destroying his body. He was aware of it. Friends who visited him in his final months described a man who seemed deeply depressed, who talked about being tired of the constant demands, and who expressed a desire to just disappear and live a normal life away from the spotlight. In this version of the theory, Elvis made a rational decision that faking his death was preferable to dying slowly on stage. He chose to stage his death, disappear, and start over as someone else, someone who could live without the crushing weight of being Elvis Presley. The question then becomes, could someone as famous as Elvis actually pull off such a deception? And if he did, what would his new life look like? He would need to choose a life that was as different from his previous existence as possible. No performing on big stages, no seeking fame or fortune, no returning to Memphis or Las Vegas or any place where he might be recognized. He would need to become someone completely ordinary, someone who would never attract the kind of attention that could blow. His cover. A pastor in rural Arkansas fits that profile almost perfectly. It is a life of service rather than celebrity. It keeps you connected to music without putting you on national stages. It gives you a community without exposing you to millions of people. And it provides a legitimate reason to stay out of the spotlight while still having a public presence in small, controlled environments where people know you as Bob Joyce, not as a celebrity or a mystery. The official story is straightforward, but the details surrounding August 16, 1977, deserve closer examination. On that morning, Elvis was scheduled to fly to Portland, Maine, to begin another concert tour. He had been up most of the night, unable to sleep, a pattern that had become common in his final months. His girlfriend Ginger Alden was with him at Graceland, and according to her account, Elvis went into the bathroom around 9 in the morning and never came out. When Ginger woke up around 1:30 in the afternoon, she found Elvis unresponsive on the bathroom floor. He was face down on the thick red carpet, his gold pajama bottoms still on, his body already showing signs of rigor mortis. She called for help, and within minutes, Graceland descended into chaos. Elvis's road manager Joe Esposito and his personal aide Al Strada tried to revive him. An ambulance was called, and Elvis was rushed to Baptist Memorial Hospital in Memphis. The doctors at Baptist Memorial worked on Elvis for approximately 30 minutes, attempting CPR, administering medications, and doing everything medically possible to restart his heart. But it was too late. Elvis Aaron Presley was pronounced dead at 3:30 p.m. Central Time. He was 42 years old. The official cause of death was cardiac arrhythmia, essentially a fatal heart rhythm abnormality. But the autopsy, conducted by Dr. Jerry Francisco, the Shelby County medical examiner, revealed a body ravaged by years of prescription, drug abuse. Elvis had significant levels of codeine, Valium, morphine, and several other medications in his system. His colon was impacted and distended, a condition that had likely caused him significant pain for months. His liver showed signs of damage, and his heart was enlarged, a condition called cardiomegaly that is often associated with long-term drug use. Dr. Francisco ruled the death natural, attributing it to heart disease rather than drug overdose. That decision has been controversial ever since. Medical experts who have reviewed the autopsy findings argue that the massive quantities of drugs in Elvis's system were the primary cause of death, and that calling it natural was a way to protect Elvis's reputation and avoid legal problems for the doctors who had been prescribing him those medications for years. The funeral was held on August 18th, just 2 days after Elvis's death. It was a media circus. Thousands of fans lined the streets outside Graceland, many of them weeping openly. Television crews from around the world broadcast live coverage. And inside Graceland, a private service was held for family and close friends before Elvis's body was taken to Forest Hill Cemetery for burial. But conspiracy theorists point to anomalies in that story that have never been adequately explained. The misspelling of Elvis's middle name on his tombstone is one. Elvis's birth certificate lists his middle name as Aaron, a spelling his parents chose to match his stillborn twin brother, Jesse Garon. But the original tombstone at Forest Hill Cemetery read Aaron, the traditional spelling. The mistake was later corrected, but believers in the faked death theory argue that the error suggests the tombstone was created hastily without proper verification, possibly because the person buried beneath it was not actually Elvis. The behavior of Elvis's father, Vernon Presley, at the funeral has also raised questions. Multiple witnesses claim that Vernon looked at the body in the casket and said it did not look like his son. Some accounts quote Vernon as saying the person in the casket was too pale, too waxy, too different from how Elvis had looked even in death. Believers argue that Vernon knew the truth, that the body in the casket was not Elvis, and that his reaction was genuine shock at seeing the deception carried out. There are also reports from funeral home workers who claimed the body did not look right. One mortician allegedly said the corpse was too heavy, that it felt wrong when they were preparing it for burial. Another claimed that certain physical characteristics did not match Elvis's known features, though these accounts have been disputed and cannot be independently verified. The speed of the burial itself raises questions. Elvis died on August 16th and was buried on August 18th, less than 48 hours later. While rapid burial is not uncommon in cases where the deceased is a public figure and the family wants to avoid prolonged media attention, it does limit the opportunity for close examination of the body. Family members who were not immediately present at Graceland had little time to travel to Memphis and view the body before burial. And then there is the strange case of the casket. Elvis was buried in a 900-pound copper casket that was sealed and placed inside a concrete vault. The weight of the casket alone has fueled speculation that it might have contained something other than a human body. Believers point to the fact that Elvis's body, even accounting for his weight at the time of death, would not require such a heavy casket. They suggest that the casket might have been weighted to make it feel as though a body was inside, while Elvis himself disappeared to start a new life. Bob Joyce has never explicitly endorsed any of these theories. He has never said that Elvis faked his death. He has never claimed to have insider knowledge about what really happened at Graceland, but he has begun speaking more openly about the idea that powerful people often control narratives, that official stories sometimes leave out inconvenient truths, and that the public does not always get the full picture of what happens to famous figures when they die. In a recent video that was recorded during a church service and later posted online, Bob addressed the rumors directly for the first time in years. He said that people have told him never to talk about certain things, never to confirm or deny certain theories, and never to engage with the speculation about his identity. He said those warnings came from people who were concerned about protecting reputations, avoiding lawsuits, and maintaining the careful balance that keeps certain stories buried. But then, Bob said something that caught everyone's attention. He said that truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how long people try to suppress it. He said that he believes Elvis Presley's story did not end the way the headlines claimed, and that there are people who know exactly what happened but have chosen to stay silent out of fear, loyalty, or legal obligation. He did not say he was Elvis. He did not claim to have evidence that Elvis faked his death, but he spoke with the kind of certainty and specificity that made people wonder how much he actually knows. The idea that Elvis might have had help faking his death is not as far-fetched as it might sound. Elvis had resources, connections, and a network of people who were fiercely loyal to him. His personal physician, Dr. George Nicopolis, had access to medical records and documentation that could have been manipulated. His manager, Colonel Tom Parker, had a history of bending rules and controlling information. And members of the Memphis Mafia had proven over the years that they would do almost anything to protect Elvis. If Elvis had wanted to disappear, he would have needed a new identity, a place to go where no one would recognize him, and a story convincing enough to explain why he was starting over. Bob Joyce's life fits that profile almost too perfectly. A quiet existence in rural Arkansas, a focus on faith and ministry that would explain why he never sought fame or fortune, and a voice and appearance that were just similar enough to Elvis to raise questions, but not so identical that anyone would immediately make the connection without prompting. The biggest obstacle to the theory is documentation. Bob Joyce has a documented history that predates Elvis's death. There are records of his birth in 1953, photographs of him as a young man, and people who knew him before Elvis allegedly died. Believers argue that those records could have been fabricated, or that Bob Joyce the pastor is not the same person as Bob Joyce the birth certificate, but that requires a level of conspiracy and coordination that becomes harder to sustain under scrutiny. The truth, as is often the case with conspiracy theories, probably lies somewhere between the extreme positions. Bob Joyce is almost certainly not Elvis Presley living under a new identity. The logistical challenges, the number of people who would need to be involved, and the lack of any credible evidence make that scenario highly unlikely. But it is entirely possible that Bob Joyce knows more about Elvis's final days than he has said publicly. He may have connections to people who were close to Elvis. He may have heard stories that were never meant to leave private conversations, and he may be using his platform to hint at truths that he cannot or will not state outright. At 71 years old, Bob Joyce is at an age where legacy starts to matter more than secrecy. If he does know something about Elvis that the world has not heard, now would be the time to speak. And his recent willingness to address the topic, even in vague and carefully worded ways, suggests that he may be preparing to say more. The phrase, "They said never reveal this," carries weight because it implies that someone, somewhere, told Bob to stay quiet. Whether that someone was a friend, a family member, a legal advisor, or someone connected to the Presley estate, the fact that Bob is now speaking suggests he has decided the time for silence is over. In his most recent statements, Bob has framed the mystery not as a question of whether Elvis is alive, but as a question of whether people are willing to accept that official narratives are sometimes incomplete. He has suggested that the Presley family, the estate managers, and others with financial and legal interests in maintaining the official story have reasons to keep certain details private. And he has hinted that those details might change the way people think about Elvis's final years, his state of mind, and the choices he made. Bob has also spoken about redemption in ways that feel personal. He talks about how everyone deserves a second chance, how fame and fortune are not worth sacrificing your soul, and how sometimes the greatest act of courage is walking away from everything the world values to find peace and purpose. Whether he is speaking about Elvis, about himself, or about some combination of the two remains unclear. The conspiracy theory surrounding Bob Joyce and Elvis Presley is not going away. As long as Bob continues to sound like Elvis, look like Elvis, and speak in ways that keep the mystery alive, people will believe. And as long as there are unanswered questions about Elvis's death, inconsistencies in the official record, and people who claim to know more than they are saying, the theory will have fuel. But maybe the truth is not as important as what the theory represents. The idea that Elvis could have walked away from fame, that he could have chosen a quiet life of service over the chaos of celebrity, appeals to something deep in the human psyche. We want to believe that legends can escape their own myths, that people can change, and that second chances are possible even for those who seem trapped by their own success. Bob Joyce, whether he is Elvis Presley or just a man who sounds like him, has become a symbol of that possibility. He represents the hope that there is more to the story, that the official narrative does not capture the full truth, and that sometimes the greatest secrets are the ones hidden in plain sight. As Bob himself has said, they told him never to reveal this. But truth has a way of surfacing. And whether Bob Joyce is the keeper of Elvis's greatest secret, or simply a devoted fan who happens to share his voice, the story he is telling, in sermons and songs and carefully chosen words, is one that millions of people want to believe. Because if Elvis's story can change, if the king can find redemption and peace after a lifetime of fame and struggle, then maybe anyone can. What do you think Bob Joyce really knows about what happened to Elvis Presley? And if the official story of Elvis's death is incomplete, what truths might still be waiting to be revealed? Let us know your thoughts. And if this mystery made you question everything you thought you knew about the King of Rock and Roll, make sure to subscribe for more untold stories that challenge the narratives we have always accepted as fact.